welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. We are back, folks. It's so good to be back with you. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
This week on the show, we are providing you with a little bit of respite from all the horrors of the dystopias that we've been looking at on our journey through dystopia. And we're looking at a couple of comedy films again, just to brighten things up a little bit. The theme this week with our comedy films is A Fish Out of Water. Two very similar comedy movies about dystopias, aren't they, James?
Yes, and both of which don't feature any fish or much water. Well, one of them has a bit of a water scene, one of the set pieces. But yeah, they're very different to the tone of some of the other films we've been looking at throughout the series. But yeah, like you said, it's going to be nice to sort of talk about something that's got a comedy slant to it for once. But there's still quite a lot of dystopic themes going on in these films, and we'll dive into them as the episode goes on, but it's going to be an interesting one, I'm sure.
Yeah, they both present a bleak dystopian future, but they cast a funny glance at it and have a bit of fun with that. So the two films that we're looking at on today's episode are Sleeper from 1973, directed by Woody Allen, and Idiocracy from 2006, directed by Mike Judge.
Yeah, two different styles of comedy going on in these two films, but both share lots of similar themes and what they're talking about, and offer quite interesting looks at what a future dystopia might look like.
Yeah, so shall we get started with the first of those, Woody Allen's Sleeper?
Is that your new movie you're working on?
No. I'm a clarinet player in 1973. I go into the hospital for a lousy operation. I wake up 200 years later and I'm Flash Gordon.
What's the name of the film?
The name of the film is Sleeper. Basically, it's an intellectual film. Most of the scenes in it are of a cerebral, almost didactic nature, and there's very little overt comedy in the film.
What's Sleeper about?
Sleeper's a highly charged emotional love story that's tender and romantic.
I hate you!
Try not to get upset. That is between myself and Diane Keaton.
I'm Luna! Luna, remember? Luna!
Your name is not Luna, is it?
So have you seen a lot of Woody Allen films, James?
I've seen a few. I haven't seen that many. I've seen enough to sort of like know some of his style of comedy, but this seemed a little bit different from the other Woody Allen films I've seen previously. This is very slapstick, this film, isn't it?
Yeah, I was immediately reminded of Modern Times and Charlie Chaplin. I know that's, Chaplin's a big inspiration for Woody Allen, but it's not his stereotypical type of comedy, and this is more in the Chaplin vein, but then thrown into a sci-fi futuristic future, which is not very Chaplin-y, I guess, or Woody Allen-y.
Yeah, I was thinking of that as well, and I was also thinking of Playtime, which we looked at earlier in the series, and sort of Jacques Tati's sort of style of comedy, and like that and Modern Times are very close to this in some ways, just in terms of like, especially with, like you were saying, with Charlie Chaplin and the sort of the slapstick style, and it being like, it's all physical comedy, isn't it, in this? And Woody Allen does reel off a lot of one-liners and things like that, and is constantly sort of like trying to be witty with his different commentary on various bits and pieces, but it is sort of like essentially like, it's like his version of a silent film, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. There are extended silent movie slapstick sequences where he's running around, slipping over on things, whacking people on the head, etc. Which, it is pretty fun, isn't it? It wasn't what I expected. I didn't know that it was going to be more on the Charlie Chaplin end of things, having not seen this one before. But it was pretty enjoyable. It also really reminded me of some of Mel Brooks' stuff. Mel Brooks also made a silent movie pastiche film called Silent Movie, which is a silent movie. So he leaned into this even more than Woody Allen did, but you can see both these kind of big 70s comedy directors calling back to things that they grew up on, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like Mel Brooks did with Blazing Saddles, and is it Son of Frankenstein?
Young Frankenstein.
Yeah, that's the one. Like Mel Brooks did with those two, this film is kind of Woody Allen taking the science fiction genre and then adding comedy into it, but then making it a kind of like pastiche almost of it.
Yeah, what also, it is definitely pastiche, very much so. Pastiche and slapstick, and the slapstick has nothing to do with pastiche really. But what I was quite surprised by was that there is a fairly thorough dystopian sci-fi plot in amongst all of it. You know, some aspects are quite silly. The nose at the end of the film is
nose.
You know, that's silly, but the idea kind of around that and what's trying to be achieved in the dystopian society felt very true to the other films we've been looking at this series.
And it did remind me of a lot of other films as well, because I think you mentioned Planet of the Apes already, Demolition Man as well, basically just in its main premise that it's a guy who's been cryogenically frozen and has just woken up in the future. And I mean, this is our fish out of water scenario for this episode, isn't it? This is what happens in both Sleeper and Idiocracy. You're given like an average Joe as your protagonist, and he's thrown into the future, and it's him sort of exploring what this world's like.
Yeah, and those films had elements of dystopia as well, didn't they? We looked at Demolition Man and Planet of the Apes in our time travel series, looking at the same concept of going into cryosleep, as you say. But definitely Demolition Man had presented a dystopian society, and even like, you know, that had elements of comedy. Wouldn't call it a funny film, but you know, you've got, is it Rob Schneider? Is that his name? You've got Rob Schneider in there, and you've got Stallone just kind of playing off the sort of overly friendly, happy society of the future film there. These two films, I think, are more on the comedy, because Demolition Man's doing that kind of action comedy trope where you just throw in a few laughs to kind of lighten the action, and not all that successfully. But there's similarities there as well, isn't there? Yeah,
I would say so, definitely. And I mean, this world then, shall we talk about what the world is like that Miles wakes up to?
Well, let's talk about the way he's introduced to it and how the audience are introduced to it, because it was quite interesting that we don't see any 1973. He's from 1973, which is when the film was made and came out. But he is awoken from his cryosleep at the start of the film, and we kind of get drip-fed information, don't we? I thought that was quite an interesting sci-fi trope, or just a general sort of futuristic storytelling trope, to make him a fish out of water, but also the audience is a fish out of water, because we're learning about the world of 2173 as Miles learns about it, aren't we?
Yeah, and I don't know if you knew this, but originally Woody Allen wanted this to be a 3-hour-long film in 2 parts. So he wanted the first part to be set in the present day, and it was all about Miles coping with life and sort of like just getting on in 1973. And then the second half was going to be the futuristic part in the future. So that could have been a whole different kind of film. And I don't know if that would have worked as well, because like you say, the whole joy of this is you're finding out more about Miles and the world as you go. And he is like an average Joe. He's a clarinet player who owns like a Whole Foods store or something, like a, what's it called? It's like something carrot, isn't it? Or something mad.
The Happy Carrot, yeah. He's basically like, he's a hipster. He's a New York hipster, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly. He's a hipster who's gone in to the dentist. It's like an ulcer or something that he's got, hasn't he? He's gone into for some sort of minor surgery and has just woken up in 2173, just not knowing what's going on. But the fact he is like a hipster as well, kind of like, it's interesting given the kind of people that he meets along the way, because he meets a certain kind of person in this dystopian society, doesn't he? He meets sort of like the sort of like the art people, doesn't he? There's a Diane Keaton plays a poet. She's like a poet, and all of her friends are quite sort of like artsy. So it's kind of like the art crowd that he's being associated with in the future.
The hippies, the free love hippies. Yeah.
The futuristic hipsters, that's what it is.
Yeah, that idea of a 3-hour, 2-part movie is incredibly strange, because, I mean, the second part would just be Sleeper, because he does just wake up in the future, and that's, you know, that sounds like it's what he had planned. And then it sounds like the first part would have just been like several other Woody Allen movies, you know, like a domestic kitchen sink comedy relationship falling apart film. So it'd just be like a normal 1973 New York set comedy with Woody Allen, at the end of which he would die and be placed into cryosleep. You could have this film and a normal Woody Allen film out of that, but that other Woody Allen film would have this very strange sci-fi ending where he's rushed into cryosleep.
Yeah, and then it'd be so disjointed as well, because it would feel just so mad going to this futuristic world from this other Woody Allen film.
I don't think it's a particularly good idea.
Well, hey, that's why it didn't get made in the end, and that's why we got this film instead.
A reasonable decision there from United Artists, I think. So when he wakes up, he's kind of unwrapped like a done baked potato.
Yes,
I very much liked that he was wearing his glasses underneath the tin foil, so he was literally just like ready to stand up. I did find it jarring because we go straight from that into like a Charlie Chaplin tramp tottering around because he's not quite woken up. I found that quite jarring. I don't know. What about you? I just wasn't expecting that kind of a scene to follow.
Yeah, I was kind of like the whole thing just threw me a little bit because it does go straight into this slapstick comedy straight off the bat, and I didn't know what to make of it because you're told about this police state as well very early on, and that like Miles has been forward out so that he can find out about the secret project that's going on. There's quite a lot of like information thrown at you, but in the meantime, it's just Woody Allen like going around not properly waking up and just hitting some guy with like some sort of like, I don't know what it is, like that blue stuff that he's got on his spoon.
Yeah, it's essentially a custard pie scene, but it's futuristic.
That's it. And it's all that. And then it just keeps going on at that pace, doesn't it? With him sort of getting disguised as a robot to try and get past people. And yeah, it just sort of like rolls like that.
Yeah, and he's got to contend with the police state that he's woken up in. So again, we have a futuristic, fascistic police state, oppressive society, as we have seen so many times this series already. The first ones we see are all decked in black, as is the convention of fascistic future societies, but we also see some all red guys who kind of reminded me of the Imperial Guard from Star Wars.
That's exactly what I was thinking when I saw those guys pop up.
But all very imperial and empire-like, which fits into the fascist kind of imagery of the whole thing, doesn't it?
Yeah, and all of the other characters have kind of like flowy costumes and stuff like that to make it look a bit futuristic, but still quite 70s. It's still got that tinge of 70s, hasn't it? Yeah,
and they've got like beanbag chairs, haven't they?
Beanbag chairs and glowing orbs, which everybody wants to fondle because they give them some sort of pleasure.
Yes. What was the orb? Was the orb like drugs?
It's weird. I don't know if I fully understood what it was, but every time that Woody Allen was getting it, he didn't want to give it to anyone else, did he? He was very intent on holding on to that orb.
Here it is.
The orb. Could I have been hit off of that orb? Milo?
They were getting like high and horny, I think, by the looks of it, or some sort of mixture. It's always uncomfortable to see Woody Allen getting horny in his films, given 30 years of events or whatever.
Yeah, problematic. But we won't go there in this episode. We're sticking to the sci-fi topics. So speaking of which, what did you think about some of the sci-fi ideas that are in this film then? Because I read somewhere that Woody Allen had a few chats with Isaac Asimov to just get him to okay some of his science fiction themes and ideas, just to see if they would work for an audience as well, like a sci-fi audience. I mean, Isaac Asimov apparently just said, "Oh, these are fun." He didn't give too much extra sort of like information, and he was already busy, so he couldn't come on board as sort of like an advisor. So I think it was just a few conversations, just sort of like, "Oh yeah, that's a nice idea. I like the jetpacks, and I like this, and I like that."
I think that's a very appropriate response from Isaac Asimov to a treatment for this film, isn't it? If you got Woody Allen coming up to you going, "I want to put some robots in my movie,"
that was a good impression. That's a really good impression.
As Isaac Asimov, I think the right thing to say is just like, "That sounds fun, Woody. That's great. You do that."
Yeah, exactly.
But like, there's not too much with the robots, is there? Because they're very. This wouldn't have fit into our AI series, for example. They are quite empty shell robots, aren't they? And it's an opportunity for Woody Allen to create a character that I thought was quite similar to the Tramp, or not necessarily similar to Tramp, but like his sci-fi take on the Tramp, right? The way that he walks and moves when he's in the disguise as the robot. It was a nice mashup of the sci-fi concepts and the Charlie Chaplin concepts, which is what he's going for in the film, isn't it? And I think it really distilled into the character that Miles performs when he's disguised as a robot.
Yeah, I mean, there's one scene which just reminded me of Modern Times so much, specifically the one where they're in the room with the robots and there's like an assembly line.
Yeah.
And yeah, Miles is just being chased around and it's just exactly the same, isn't it? It's the same kind of like physical comedy and the same sort of industrialization in the background. So he's definitely borrowing from like Chaplin, and I think he said like Buster Keaton as well was a influence, and obviously like the Marx Brothers, all that kind of stuff. He's just adding that into the film.
Can I help you?
Would you change his head for me, please? Something a little more aesthetic.
Right.
And check his works. He acts peculiar.
You got room in there for another head change? Yeah, sure.
I thought that we were going to get like a Modern Times scene when, when he gets his job and he's reassimilated into society, he's got to thread tape onto a massive, what would you call it, reel, so big reel-to-reel thing. And it's just sort of flat on a wall, but it's a very complicated reeling of tape. Just as soon as I saw it, the shape of it looked like something that Charlie Chaplin would get stuck in and fall through, even though it was 2D and not flat on a wall. That was what my mind jumped to, and I was like, we're going to get a scene where he goes through like a big one of them. I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't, but it was weird that just the shape of seeing that on the wall, and with all the stuff that happened in the film so far, I was immediately thinking like, this is going to be another Charlie Chaplin scene. He's going to get caught in that or something like that. I was a little bit disappointed that it didn't play out that way.
Yeah, I spent a lot of the film sort of going like, oh, is this going to happen? Is this going to happen? And I mean, most of the stuff, like the set pieces are pretty much, they're set up early on, like the big pudding scene where he's in the kitchen and he's trying to make this food and it just goes all over the place and he's trying to get it off of trying to sweep it up with a broom. It's like all of this physical comedy, which is just happening in the background, I think, which is like such an interesting thing to see from Woody Allen.
Yeah, I think I think a good example of that as well is the big banana peel, because to my shame, I actually didn't see that one coming, and I thought that's a really good gag, but also to kind of weave it into your sci-fi film and make it more of a sci-fi concept with this giant canoe-sized genetically modified banana, but then peeling strips off it and getting into a fight, and the fight leads to, slipping over and over and over, just to do the classic slipping on a banana peel gag, but blow it up and make it science fiction-y.
Yeah.
I like that.
And I mean, the fact that they're using genetically modified crops as well is such a science thing to put in there, because they've got these, like you said, the massive banana. There was like a massive celery as well. And and a massive chicken just running around, just looking horrendous and scary.
The chicken is a bit weird, isn't it?
Yeah. And they make a really interesting point at the beginning. Like they say that fatty foods are actually, they find out in the future that they're good for you, don't they?
Yeah, I don't quite get the joke there. I think there's something about 1970s health food culture, because obviously he owns a health food shop, and they reference a few trendy health foods, but I can't remember, like wheat germ was in there. Yeah. I think people still eat/drink wheat germ. I don't know what wheat germ is, James. I don't really understand it. But they mentioned that, and they mentioned a couple of other like health foods that I don't think people eat anymore, more like a fad health food. So I guess that's the joke, but it does seem like it's like, no, we know they're not good for you. Like it's not something that's gonna come back around in 200 years. Like it's been bad for you for 200 years already, and it will continue to be. And smoking as well, obviously, is grouped in with that, isn't it?
Yeah, because when Diane Keaton's character is eating the giant celery, she's not like, this is disgusting. So she's obviously eaten like vegetables before,
but she's disappointed that it doesn't have like sauce and seasoning and all of that. Although that's more just a joke, it's not fancy enough. Yeah,
you want some fancy celery. If you've got a massive celery like that, you've got to spice it up a bit.
If I had a celery that big, James, I'd need a swimming pool of hummus to enjoy it.
Oh yeah. Oh. Lovely. You could swim in the hummus. Actually, that probably wouldn't be very hygienic.
You definitely shouldn't do that. Yeah.
You just sink to the bottom. I mean, again, it'd be another great set piece for this film, but they missed the trick.
It would.
There. Yeah. But the GM crops, again, reminded me of What Happened to Monday, because in What Happened to Monday, it's genetically modified food that has become the reason that the population is overpopulated. And again, like Soylent Green, so it works quite well off the back of some of the films we've looked at previously, just in that respect. And again, we're seeing there's a change in resources in these dystopias. So resources are obviously so important to society just in general, but again, we're seeing like a future change, and things have slightly sort of like differed to how they are now. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah. And these films are tapping into like fears about genetically modified food as well, aren't they? Which is quite interesting. I think and it's interesting you mentioned What Happened to Monday as well. I was thinking about that since we watched it. It's quite strange to see that kind of fear mongering around GM food in a film so recent, in that it's more, I think, more understandable in Sleeper, but like, well, actually, but then it's not a fear of GM food in Sleeper, is it? It's showing that that's just what's used, and it's not causing any problems in the society. It's actually working, and I don't know, that using that fear in film is always quite interesting, because like we shouldn't be pumping our crops full of dangerous chemicals, but at the same time, genetic modification is just a necessary part of agriculture, isn't it? Like everything's genetically modified. If you select the best strains of courgette to get nicer courgettes, and then continue to do that for a few crops, you've genetically modified your crop of courgettes.
Yeah.
And then you can make them bigger, and that's how you get, marrows and giant marrows, and then you win competitions. And then if you can do that, you can grow a banana big enough that when you get in a fight over it, you're both falling over. It's fine. It's good. There are benefits.
But how do they get to the giant chickens?
Not sure about the giant chicken. I mean, it looked like a man in a suit, so...
Maybe it was just a man in a suit the whole time, and he was just advertising
it was
something.
Hilariously bad. Like, I mean, making giant fruit for a film is a fairly simple prop, isn't it? But I did like how the banana like peeled away. It had a very realistic peel, and the flesh underneath. It looked great. And then the man in the chicken suit just over the other side of the field. It made me laugh. I suppose that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I've just remembered another thing which I sort of like found out when I did a little bit of reading on this is, so we've already talked about how it was like, it seems like it could be a silent film, this, and apparently Woody Allen did conceive the story as a future where people are forbidden to talk. And that was going to be his way of making it into a silent film. I find that quite an interesting thing as well, because language is something that we keep coming up against, looking at dystopias and the importance of language. And we'll see it in Idiocracy, sort of like a different sort of view on that. But there's like a certain language in this as well. You see it in the scene, in the dinner scene. They talk in a specific way, and they use kind of weird slang words. Like, I felt a bit like you were kind of like taken aback a bit by some of the stuff they were saying. You had to try and listen in to figure out what they were talking about.
Like what?
There were things that they were saying like, oh, this is Keane, but I think they're actually referring to the painter of the picture at one point. Like she was like,
Yeah,
"Oh, this is keen," and stuff like that.
I know what you mean. I was trying to figure out if that was 70s slang that I don't know.
Yeah,
but it felt very specific, didn't it? So it did sort of feel like it's supposed to sound like 70s slang, but he's used a different word, because she says it's keen and then it's super keen or something like that. She puts a sort of qualifier on it of some sort. And
I think that might refer to the painter, but I think there was other stuff I was noticing in it, but it could just be that threw me when I was listening to it, and I was like, oh, this is weird terminology. Like, this is, I like using that as like a slang word. Oh, this is keen. It's proper keen.
Yeah, I don't know. That one was lost on me. Too smart of a joke, I think, I'm afraid, in this slapstick movie.
So like they've got the language thing going on in here, but the other thing is the way that they treat sex in the future. I thought that was like an interesting way of doing it.
Yeah, you said you didn't want to. You said you didn't want to get into it, but like you can't really not talk about sex in Woody Allen films, can you?
Yeah, I mean, it's just because it's so specific in this, in terms of the depiction of the future society, like the fact that, like, they say that all men are impotent, and these are quotes, all men are impotent and the women are frigid, is what the terminology they use in this, which is like, it's quite problematic terminology just in general, but they've just thrown that in there, and then basically they've got these big orgasm boxes that they step into, and then that's how they have sex. And like, sex has been something which we've sort of like has been something which has been repressed in these dystopias we've looked at previously, and it's sort of like, or it's liberated, like in A Brave New World. And I think this has more in common with that, doesn't it? Because it's all about sort of like the pleasure of the act and the sort of society in it, and sort of like indulging in those kind of things. And I mean, they have this massive mansion where they live, and it's all futuristic, and they'll just go off to the swimming pool that they've got in their house. You don't really see sort of like a part of the society which are not well off. Everybody's doing well that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think like we have seen a lot of dystopian takes on sex throughout the series, but it's usually not sex that is suppressed, but rather emotion tends to be suppressed, and the effects of allowing an oppressed population to experience too much emotion. So everyone was having sex in Brave New World and loving it, but there was very little emotion there. And it seems to be the opposite, I guess, in Sleeper, because they do have emotional connections to each other, don't they? Like that party scene is it's not devoid of emotion. It's slightly strange. They're all taking drugs, but they seem to be capable of emotion and emotional connections. It's just that sex has been completely removed from any of that. So Luna has like what seems to be a boyfriend. They were going to have like group sex. I don't know how that works with the orgasm boxes, but that didn't work out. So they just pop into the orgasm box, just the two of them. So she seems to, I think that's like her partner, isn't it? That she does that with. They do have these emotional connections there, but yeah, it's just over time, the act of sex has just left relationships because all the men are impotent and the women are frigid.
And I mean, the fact that Luna studied oral sex as her PhD, and the thing which that sort of brings up is that like sex is treated as like an ancient subject now that you would study at a university or something, like ancient Greek or something like that, or Latin, I don't know, like something along those lines, because it's so archaic to this society.
Yeah, and she's also got like she studied the more technical aspects of it. She's an orgasm box technician or something like that. She's somehow related to that industry. But yeah, she also has the more academic side, which is studying oral sex. So she knows about it, but in the same way, like you say, in the same way that PhD people nowadays know about Latin culture and Latin works of art and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is like, it's mad, all of these kind of like things that have been thrown into the film. But the other thing which like seemed a bit strange as well was this whole, we've talked about uprisings and revolutionaries already, and the way they depict the underground is kind of a bit, it's just sort of like in the background, isn't it? Miles has this mission to uncover Project Ares, but it's not really his mission, and he's not really bothered by any of it. All of these sort of like plot threads don't really matter to the film. They're just sort of in there. But there is an underground, and there are sort of people trying to take out the supreme leader. And what did you think about that sort of element of the film?
I was quite surprised when it came back into the plot, to be honest, because it certainly seemed like for the first half of the movie, more than the first half, I'd say, the Resistance and Project Ares and all of that was just a MacGuffin to propel him through the slapstick set pieces. So I wasn't actually expecting any kind of resolution really on the Project Ares Underground Rebellion plot line. But when I said earlier that like there is a pretty coherent, solid sci-fi plot line, that's what I was talking about. It does come back at the end of the film, and we have this whole final act, which is seeing that rebellion through to completion, I guess, and going through and doing all that stuff, which I really enjoyed because I just wasn't expecting it. I was fairly happy with the loosely strung together slapstick sequences. That was fine. That was an enjoyable comedy movie. But I enjoyed coming back to that and actually saying like, there is a bit of a sci-fi plot here, and I will resolve it in the final act of the film.
Yeah, and the fact that like Luna and Miles's characters are kind of like put in different situations. Like Miles, like you said earlier, Miles ends up being like reprogrammed and made a part of that society, whereas Luna is part of the rebellion and she's like hanging around with a bunch of people in black turtlenecks.
Just on that reprogramming, I mean, what did you think about that? Because it was probably most similar to, I guess, 1984 of the films that we've seen this series. But obviously that was horrific in 1984. And then we get this quite strange scene with Miles. He goes into like a drawer, but then it's like a Miss America pageant as part of his reprogramming. It was all very odd. And then he comes out and he's actually fairly happy. It's not like Winston at the end of 1984. He's genuinely enjoying being a functioning member of the dystopian society, isn't he?
Yeah, and there's that weird confession scene as well, where, like, again, we've got kind of like elements. I don't know if it's an element of religion really in this, but he just goes to a robot thing and then says all the things. Like, he confesses his sins, but it's just given like a receipt saying like, you're all good now, head off. Is
this from before or after THX 1138? Because that really reminded me of the booths where you go in and talk to Olm 000.
I think they're around the same time, because they're both 70s films.
Yeah, that's interesting, that kind of the commodification of specifically Catholic tropes, isn't it? The confession booth, not just Christian, but the kind of commodification of Christian tropes in a sci-fi dystopia is just something you can transact with, because it is quite transactional, isn't it? I've never done it, but going into a confession booth, as I understand it from movies, that's the only way I've ever seen it happen, but you go in, say your piece, the priest tells you which prayer or prayers you need to say in order to atone, and that's your receipt. Like what Miles gets, your receipt is a list of prayers to read, and then you do it, and then you've got atonement, and it's the transaction is complete, isn't it?
Yeah, and then he's just like able to just go back and do whatever he was doing again, and he knows he can just pop back in. I mean, that's how they treat it in this film, and it's an interesting way of commodifying religion, isn't it? It's just something, it's something like dystopias obviously seem to be doing in the films we're looking at.
I think it's a reasonable satirical take on that specific transaction of Catholicism, but it's interesting that these two films were kind of picking up on it at roughly the same time and putting it into a dystopian context, mixing it in with the, I guess, capitalism aspect of it as well, mixing in the religion and the capitalism in that specific way. And speaking of the capitalism aspect of it, the revolutionaries are explicitly Marxist, aren't they? I think it's Luna that says they want to install a Marxist regime. Is it Luna or Miles? Because if Miles says it, you can't take it too seriously, can you? But I think Luna says it.
I think Luna says it, when she's like indoctrinating Miles into the underground.
Yeah, because she's recently read a load of Karl Marx and she wants to introduce Miles to it. And obviously he's being familiar with all the 20th century people from that scene earlier where he's identifying the photos. That was a more fun kind of Woody Allen less of the Charlie Chaplin stuff, that where he's describing Norman Mailer and Joseph Stalin and so on and so forth. A nice introduction to the character, because I wasn't too clear if he was supposed to be an idiot or just, a wind-up merchant. But I think he's the latter.
Yeah, because there are certain moments when you're not quite sure. But yeah, you're right. As it goes on, he's constantly just making wisecracks, which, show his intelligence a bit more. But I still felt like you don't really get a sense of it, of like why it's a police state. You've got this leader who, in reality, the picture of him is this guy called Timothy Leary, who was like this counterculture guru from the 1960s. And he was like a psychologist, a writer, and was a strong advocate for psychedelic drugs. So that probably helped shape this future dystopia if he is their supreme leader. But you don't really get a sense of sort of what he's doing that's bad, or what the police are doing. There's no sort of like enforcement in this. They're just in the background. All that they do is chase Miles around a bit because he's escaped from this like science lab. Yeah,
so if they catch you and you are deemed to, have offended against society in some way, you will have your mind erased and you'll be reprogrammed, which is what happens to Miles halfway through the film. And I guess we do see the kind of cruelty of the police state in that Luna tries to be a good citizen and turns Miles in, but as kind of a witness to his, what he's doing and what he's up to, the police kind of on the spot decide not even to reprogram her, but just to kill her. So we're given that little window into the fact that this is a cruel police state that is over exercising its powers on the people, which is what we see in every one of most of these dystopian stories. But yeah, what's missing is that the background on the leader and what the society wants beyond this just forceful control through the violent police. But what do they actually want to achieve? What are they trying to prevent the scientists from achieving? All of this stuff. Like, we don't get that. That's where it's not quite rounded out as a real sci-fi dystopia, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, Miles does make a sort of comment on this at the end when he says, even if they get rid of the dictator who's in charge at the moment, there's just going to be another one and he'll be just as bad. So why bother getting involved is kind of his point. But yeah, they don't really dig deep into those kind of themes and stuff. But speaking of sort of the dictator and the supreme leader, what did you think about Project Ares and this weird cloning stuff that's going on in the background as well?
I like Project Ares because it feels like a proper dystopian concept that the leader's been dead for a year, although they say they don't treat him as dead, do they? Like, they've got his nose and the nose has been kept alive, therefore the leader is alive. That. Yeah. And it felt like I said earlier, like, apart from the fact that it's the nose, it's like, that's obviously like the comedic element of it, is it that it's just a nose, but I can totally see like a brain in a jar being done in a more serious dystopian film where they're trying to resurrect or clone a leader just using a brain in a jar, or keep the leader going, just sort of interacting with the world through being a brain in a jar. I liked all that. I thought that was like legit sci-fi stuff. I can imagine Asimov going, yeah, that's fun.
I like the brain in the jar comparison. I hadn't really thought of that, but it's such an obvious link, isn't it? But yeah, having a nose and keeping that alive, I did quite enjoy that, and just the idea that they're going to clone him from the nose and make a full leader again. It's an interesting one.
And again, it's the kind of the inspiration from 1984 as well. The idea that your figurehead is completely omnipresent and the most important single person in society, but he also might not even be there, and nobody actually meets him, and he doesn't actually do anything in real life. But as a figurehead, he's crucially important, and that must be maintained at all costs. Otherwise, society will completely crumble.
Yeah, and it feels like there's got to be a face for the leader in all of these dystopias as well. Have we come across a dystopia where it's not got like a supreme leader or some sort of like?
Well, I mean, THX was a good example of that, wasn't it? Because there was the sort of deity that they confessed to, but we never got a sense that the deity was like a an actual functioning governing leader. I think it was just a religious figure, and then we never saw any kind of. That was the whole thing about THX, wasn't it? It was just like this Ouroboros eating itself, where you're producing robots to oppress you, and you just keep doing that in a cycle.
Yeah, so it's interesting that we have like that's been the only one we've really come across like that. I suppose Brave New World a little bit, but the sort of like the boss was kind of like in charge a bit more, but he wasn't kind of like, he didn't seem so much like a dictator per se. He was more sort of like experimenting in sort of certain people's societal movements. No,
but I think he does fit into the trope, doesn't he? It was hierarchical in Brave New World, and he was not a supreme leader character, but he was above anyone else we met in the story, and he was also abusing his power, wasn't he? And he was very hypocritical, that is the trope that we see in all of them, the hypocrisy at the top and the abuse of power, and that's definitely what was going on in Brave New World, even though it wasn't quite a supreme leader of a country or the world in that case.
Yeah, so it feels like you need to have that kind of presence in these dystopian films. Yeah. So just in general, what were your favourite set pieces in this film? Because it is a film of various comedic set pieces which come one after another. Were there any bits which stuck out to you?
I don't know. For me, like, I did find all the slapstick stuff charming, but none of it was like my favourite. At the end, when Luna and Miles are both masquerading as doctors, that for me was when it really hit its stride just as a film, because Diane Keaton and Woody Allen have incredible on-screen chemistry. Diane Keaton is just like, she's wonderful. So really it was just about getting more screen time with her and allowing them to kind of bounce off each other and be playful and silly together, more so than the earlier scenes where they're kind of adversarial. But when they're working together and pretending to be doctors, that I found all that stuff genuinely funny. What about you? Yeah,
I loved all those bits, but I also quite liked the various chase scenes, because there's just something about the way those chase scenes worked. I mean, the thing which sticks out for me is Miles's inflatable suit that he's going around in, and it's like an anti-gravity suit, and he's floating around and then ends up in the water, and then he's sort of like, it's all of those little bits which I quite enjoyed, and just like, the sort of like the obvious comedy bits I quite liked, because I just wasn't expecting them.
Fair enough. I think I'm the opposite. I think it was the more obvious sci-fi bits that I liked, because I wasn't expecting them.
But hey, that's probably why this film works then, because there's got a bit of both for whatever you're feeling like.
After looking at the nose, I get the feeling that what we ought to do perhaps is postpone the cloning.
Excuse me, Doctor, but that would be a tragic mistake.
See, I think what the computer is failing to take into account is what I call the Pinocchio factor, which states that the square root of proboscis is equal to the sum of the sinuses over 7.
Well, what is your opinion, Doctor? Should we proceed with the cloning or should we postpone?
Ah, indeed.
So we talked about supreme leaders in this, and there is the supreme leader. There's a very interesting character who serves as the supreme leader / president in Idiocracy. So I think we should start talking about Idiocracy so we can get to a bit of conversation about that character as well.
James, do you know what feels even better than stepping into an orgasm box and spending 5 minutes in there?
What?
Signing up at patreon.com/journey3sci-fi and listening to all our fantastic bonus episodes. They're there. And not to mention the warm feeling you get inside from knowing that you're supporting this podcast.
Satisfaction guaranteed.
So if you're interested in experiencing those carnal delights, listeners, hop on over.
Carnal delights.
Hop on over to patreon.com/journey3sci-fi and join at the £4 tier to experience those episodes. We'll see you there.
At the dawn of the 21st century, the Army began a top-secret experiment.
Meet Joe Bowers, our first subject for the human hibernation experiment. As you know, this is highly classified. However, if successful, we believe humans can be stored indefinitely.
However, the trial run was prone to human error.
See you in a year.
And Joe slept slightly longer than expected. Half a millennium, to be exact. From Mike Judge, creator of Office Space and Beavis and Butthead.
Oh my God! Oh.
If you were the smartest person in the world...
This goes in your mouth. This one goes in your butt. Hang on a second. This one goes in your mouth.
And we're stuck with the dumbest people in history.
If you have one bucket that holds 2 gallons and another bucket that holds 5 gallons, how many buckets do you have?
2?
What would you do?
So 2006, Idiocracy, Mike Judge. Are you a fan of his comedy stylings?
I'm a huge fan of King of the Hill, but I've never really liked Beavis and Butthead. I thought the film was quite good, but I've never really been able to get into Beavis and Butthead. And that's weird because this is slightly more on the Beavis and Butthead side of his humour, but I do like this film. Are you a fan of Mike Judge?
He did Office Space as well, didn't he?
Oh yeah, that's an excellent
yeah,
film.
because I watched that recently and I really enjoyed that. So I think he's very good at... His comedy is based so much on real life, but he gets his characters to really sort of like be ordinary, but ordinary in a sort of humorous way. So it's the humor of the mundane, I think he's got in a lot of his comedy. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at, and especially with this film.
Yeah, and it's the social satire as well is what he's interested in, isn't it? But you're right that his settings are usually very mundane. Offices, propane salesmen's homes, etc. That's where Mike Judge kind of tends to operate. And certainly he's not a sci-fi creator. So this is really outside of his comfort zone, I guess. Or, that might not be fair, but it stands out in his oeuvre, doesn't it, as a very different film. Yeah,
but I think what he's doing is very sort of like, it's linked to the time, as any good sci-fi is. It's very tapped into the zeitgeist. And the zeitgeist of 2006 was like in the middle of the Bush era, wasn't it? In America. So it's making a lot of sort of comments on the type of people which were around during that time and the sort of the conflicts that arose sort of like between different people's beliefs and stuff. And I mean, all of that's in this. How do you think he differs from sort of Allen's comedy then? Because Allen's like in Sleeper, Woody Allen's doing lots of slapstick stuff, but there are elements of his sort of like social like satire in there a little bit as well. His comments on sort of like natural foods, health foods and things like that. How do you think they are different though?
I mean the style is very different, but there is a link of observational comedy, I suppose, isn't there? Like Woody Allen is he focuses on himself and like his reactions to society and relationships and all of that stuff. That's his comedy, but it is kind of observational in that sense. Whereas Mike Judge, I don't know if Mike Judge has a stand-up comedy background, but he's not famous for it. He's famous for being a writer, director. So he's doing observational comedy based around creating characters that represent aspects of society, whereas Woody Allen always plays the same character reacting to other aspects of society. But there is a link there, I think, in the observational nature of it.
And that makes sense because it feels like, because comedians are, like you said, they're so observational in their comedy. Everything has to be about something or somebody's reaction to something, and it has to be relatable to the audience. And dystopias are films and fiction which are linked to things that could happen, but they have to be relatable enough that you could see them happening in the future. So I think there's definitely a connection between this kind of comedy and sci-fi dystopian stuff that's going on.
It's true of a lot of sci-fi though, isn't it? We've talked about it before, the way that sci-fi is often holding up a mirror to society. That's one of the main things that sci-fi can do and often does do. And comedy often does the same. But yeah, I think dystopias especially kind of allow the comedians to do that because dystopias have this like inherently socio-political element to it, which is what a lot of comedians focus on and are interested in. So yeah, there's scope there for them to do this observational kind of political humour, but set it in a kind of fantastical setting, i.e. 500 years in the future, which is what Mike Judge has chosen to do in Idiocracy.
As the 21st century began, human evolution was at a turning point. Natural selection the process by which the strongest, the smartest, the fastest reproduced in greater numbers than the rest. A process which had once favored the noblest traits of man now began to favor different traits. Most science fiction of the day predicted a future that was more civilized and more intelligent. But as time went on, things seemed to be heading in the opposite direction, a dumbing down.
So what's the central premise, though, that gets us to 500 years in the future? There's like a premise and a thesis at the start of the film, isn't there?
So the original sort of setup of the film is they've got like a scene at the beginning which explains how the human race is going to progress in the future. And basically what it's saying in this is that the smarter, more intelligent people are not going to breed at the same pace as some of the lesser intelligent people of the population. That's what it's saying basically in broad strokes. And this is actually an idea which was written about by a guy called Henry Herbert Goddard. And he wrote it in this book called The Kallikak Family. Basically, in this study, he was comparing the life of this, I think it was a revolutionary, and he married two different women from two different backgrounds, and then sort of like he looked at their families afterwards, and then one half of the family were sort of like, well, they were basically considered sort of like less well off, less intelligent, and they just kept breeding and breeding and breeding, whereas the other side of the family, their line didn't go as far as the other side.
Yeah, Mike Judge has kind of picked up on that, but I think he's going in a different route. I mean, because Goddard was a eugenicist and was obviously advocating for, I think when he's talking about like feeble-mindedness, it's a slightly different thing to what Mike Judge is talking about. It's an interesting idea, because basically he's saying that evolution doesn't work the same way anymore, which is that like as evolution happens over a long period of time, it's certain necessary traits for survival that get picked out. But the idea here is that we're at the top of the food chain, we're in complete control of everything, so we're not selecting traits for survival in our reproduction. We have the freedom to reproduce as we would wish. And then he's also introducing, I guess, the idea of like anxiety about starting a family in that opening scene, isn't he? The one couple that don't have kids are basically overthinking the idea of having kids until one of them dies, whereas someone else who is more reckless just doesn't care, and he has hundreds of descendants within a very small period of time. That's the kind of idea that Mike Judge has picked up and runs wild in Idiocracy's future. Yeah,
and I mean, Mike Judge has like directly said it's not about eugenics per se, this film. He's making lots of other comments on, like, I think it's dysgenics, I think is the term.
Dysgenics? I don't know what that is.
So I've had to look up the actual definition of dysgenics. So it says here that it is the tending to promote survival of or reproduction by less well-adapted individuals. So again, I don't know enough about this kind of stuff to properly delve deep into it. I'm trying to sort of like get through the weeds and figure out exactly all the different themes in there. But there are some heavyweight themes in this film, aren't there?
Yeah, there are heavyweight themes. I think that the idea that it's like inherited traits, I don't think that's what has happened in the 500 years. You know, you've got like institutional stupidity, but I don't think it's necessarily because stupid people had children and their children were stupid by nature. I think it's that society, and, you know, presumably this is influenced by the Bush era government, society has sort of embraced stupidity and championed stupidity, and then that's a race to the bottom intellectually, and that has happened over the course of 500 years. What I find interesting about the film is like, he doesn't appear in the future, and he's not immediately celebrated as the smartest man in the world, even though he clearly is. It's not until he's tested. He's met with hostility at talking in a slightly more intellectual way. I mean, what's dated horribly is that they call him the F-slur.
The terminology is terrible in this film. They do, like, when I was watching it, I kept being like, Jesus, is this
I
like...
was wincing at some of those words.
It's like, it hasn't aged well. There's lots of terminology in this. So just a flag if you do watch this film.
It's very playgroundy, isn't it? Like, I don't know what it was like when you were at school, but the kind of playground bully tactic of just rejecting any kind of intelligence, talking like you might have any kind of intelligence is completely rejected. That's what it felt like in this film, but it's spread throughout the entire society. So everyone is at that kind of bottom level stupid.
Yeah, I mean the language, the use of language is really weird and it is problematic in this film because the terminology, like you said, it made me wince as well. Like I was not on board with a lot of the things they were saying, but I kept sort of like looking at it in a way that. So they explain how the language came about. They say it was sort of a mixture of, quote, hillbilly, valley girl, inner city slang, and various grunts. And that's how they describe this language. But I think there's more to it than that as well, because they're using like these horrendous words to describe things, but everybody uses them, so they've lost their meaning. But that doesn't make them any better to have in this film. But they've got all of this stuff. And the other thing I found weird was sort of the way that they used quite a lot of like Latin slang, like from sort of like the Hispanic community in there. And that was seen as something which had sort of like had come through. And that didn't quite sit well with me, the fact that had been something that they'd incorporated into this sort of like this society.
Yeah, it's a good point. I hadn't really clocked that. I'm going to have to rethink my position on this film a little bit.
Yeah, but the way I was trying to think about it was like, okay, so it's making a comment on like what a potential society could look like if all of the worst things happen, sort of like all of the worst kind of like terms and people's actions and stuff, if they all stuck around and became the predominant thing in society.
You say that, but like I don't know if that's quite it, because like some of the slurs that they use are very offensive. But this film was made in 2006, and I mean I can distinctly remember playing Halo 3 in 2007 or 8. And those words that they use were incredibly common to hear from people playing that game and other similar games over the internet. You know, like it. I don't know how much it can be said that it's like, oh, these are the worst possible things. They were actually very commonplace. I don't think Mike Judge is celebrating those words by having everyone say them all the time so casually, but and as derogatory terms. But they were incredibly common at the time the film was made. I guess that's the point, isn't it? That they are offensive terms, and he's saying like, we're using these terms too liberally. We can't keep doing that. It's going to lead to the situation in this film.
And it's also sort of about, if everybody's doing the same thing, that becomes the norm.
Yeah.
And then if that is the norm, then everybody sort of acts in that same way. So, and everything's commercialized in this film as well. There's so much commercialism in it. And I think that's another thing which you come across plenty of times in dystopias, the sort of commercialization of society and how like entertainment companies are using that to their advantage. And everything is just like, it's so commercialized in this. You've got like, what things did they have in there that sort of stuck out for you?
Well, I quite like the shirts that some characters wear. Like a few characters just wear a shirt that is just a repeating pattern of brand logos. That reminded me of WALL-E. There's a lot of stuff in this that reminds me of WALL-E. The piles of garbage everywhere. You know, how the world looks outside is very... I mean, it looks literally like what the world of WALL-E must have been like just before the Axiom took off, you know, before humanity abandoned Earth. And the branded clothing is something they do in WALL-E as well. But also it reminded me of some of the dangerous games that we've been looking at this series, you know, where when Joe has to go into rehabilitation, but that's a death sport where he has to basically do like a demolition derby robot wars thing with a tiny car.
Yeah, Jesus, that scene.
Yeah. What about you? What were some of those aspects that you're enjoying commercialization?
Well, I think just the whole, like the fact, obviously the main thing in the film is the fact that they're using like Gatorade.
Oh yeah.
to water their plants, which is hilarious because it's just got to a point where that's the only thing that people drink. But to the extent that when they change it to water, their stock plummets because they don't know how to deal with anything, with like economics or anything like that. So they just don't know what to do when it's not the only source of source of liquid used in their society. So I really loved all of that stuff.
Yeah, the economy is like almost completely in the tank, partially because they can't grow any crops. But then when they do the one thing that might help crops grow, the economy tanks even further because, everything is propped up by this one sports drink, Brando. I don't think you can call it a sports drink given the context of the movie, but yeah.
It's got electrolytes, Matt.
It's got electrolytes. It's got what plants crave. Yeah.
What the hell is this?
Tastes like Gatorade.
Is that Brando stuff?
They're watering crops with a sports drink?
Rondo the Thirst Mutilator had come to replace water virtually everywhere. Water, the basic component of all life, had been deemed a threat to Brondo's profit margin. The solution came during the budget crisis of 2330, when the Brondo Corporation simply bought the FDA and the FCC, enabling them to say, do, and sell anything they wanted.
So they've got all of that. I think the massive Costco was great as well. Like this humongous building, where they're just going around. It's got everything, and there's just like miles and miles of red sofas and things like that, and just you're never going to find what you need because it's just everywhere.
Yeah, that was cool. That reminded me of Fallout. Well, the outside did, the kind of like abandoned Costco with the giant car park, that shot overlooking it. I really like all of the landscape shots in this film. Like it's a good use of animation. Obviously Mike Judge has got an animation background, but it's got a nice unique style, which is, it's obviously computer generated, but it's quite stylized, so it looks like it's leaning more into animation than just a sort of standard CGI landscape of the future. It's got that kind of stylized quality to it that I thought was very good. And the shot overlooking the Costco is a brilliant example of that.
Yeah, all of that stuff I really loved. But did you find that some of this stuff was a bit close to the mark as well, just in terms of some of the stuff that was happening? So, like the Starbucks has become a place where you go and have oral sex rather than just a Starbucks. So recently, there's been a cafe in Switzerland which has opened up as a fellatio cafe. So that's become a reality. One of the things which I did not see as becoming one of the things which happens in the future. The fully automated fast food. Now, have you been to a McDonald's recently? Probably not, because you're vegetarian.
Yeah.
And McDonald's is quite shit. But in McDonald's now, if you go in there, you basically have to download an app to order your food in some of the McDonald's. So you order it ahead of time and you get in there and it's fully automated. You just get it. It's given to you straight away. You get a number, done, in and out. It's so weird how that's become a thing.
Yeah, it's a bit of a complicated thing because I've sort of broadly got no problem with like a sexy cafe in Switzerland. That doesn't seem dystopian to me. But I've seen McDonald's, and I don't know if both of them do it, but I know Burger King, you have to interact with like a giant iPad in order to place an order. Yeah. That does feel quite dystopian. And it feels like we're not too far away from being chastised for not having enough money in our account, like the woman near the start of Idiocracy is. That does feel very dystopian. But like the biggest one of all is that when you have this society that is just obsessed with its most base desires and a race to the bottom of stupidity, into that steps a leader played in this film by Terry Crews, played brilliantly and hilariously by Terry Crews. But that one was quite close to the bone as well. I think that's more of a comment on Bush at the time, seeming like the stupidest president you could possibly have. I guess Mike Judge couldn't have possibly foreseen what would happen in 2 presidential cycles' time.
Or could he? Is that what all this is? Just like him peering into the future and writing a script about it?
Well, I mean, there is an element of that, isn't there? It's because, you can say, like, if you're going to elect someone as stupid and incompetent as George Bush, then in several years' time, you will end up electing someone more stupid and more incompetent. You're right. He is just taking a look and extrapolating it.
And there's the idea of the celebrity around it as well, because President Camacho is a wrestler, isn't he? He's a professional wrestler.
Wrestler / porn star.
/ porn star, of course. Can't forget that bit, especially not in this dystopian film.
You know what's quite interesting about that is that, like, if you are in this world, in Idiocracy, if you're a professional wrestler, if you've had a career as a professional wrestler and a career as a successful porn actor, you probably are quite well equipped to be president. It sounds like he's one of the most successful and productive people. He is one of the most successful and productive people we see. You know, Frito is a lawyer, but like being a lawyer is a complete joke. It's unrecognizable. Same with the doctor. We see these professions that need quite a lot of study and intelligence to enter. They're no good at the job, basically, as we would recognize it. But, you know, Camacho's, he's confident, he's cocky, he's beloved, he's well known. He actually does have what it takes to be the leader of this society. He's the leader they deserve.
Yeah, that makes sense, actually, thinking about it. And it's his charisma as well, because he's got all of that kind of stuff. And that's what gets people behind him. And that's why he has become president. But you talking about the professions as well just reminded me of one scene very close to the beginning when he goes to the doctor's surgery and there's a woman at reception and she's trying to understand what's wrong with him and she's trying to pick the right picture. I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah. Again, like it's like that wouldn't be so bad. The problem is that like she is too stupid to really understand what's going on and it takes too long. But, you know, that's quite an effective triage in principle, isn't it? Which is actually what happens to you when you go to A&E. You are triaged. Actually, I guess, I mean, in real life, you're triaged quickly.
I thought you meant like they've got a picture thing.
No, you're triaged quickly. And the reason you're triaged quickly is because there's a competent professional who does that and figures out what's wrong with you. But I guess, you know, there's something in just being able to, what if you could just press a button and then you know where to go and get it sorted? I don't know. I'm doubting it as I'm saying it because like, you do actually need the triage there to tell you.
As long as you don't have to go in for the checkup and then have the free things you have to insert into various orifices.
Yeah.
And when he gets them confused, it's quite a moment.
Your illness is very important to us.
Next.
Welcome to the Health Master Inferno, powered by Cure Me Technology.
This goes in your mouth. This one goes in your ear. And this one goes in your butt.
One thing I really liked there, that machine and also the machine where Joe gets his identity tag tattooed on him were both quite filthy and disgusting. Did you notice particularly the identity tag? There was like brown staining beneath the hole where he put his arm in. It was really disgusting.
Yeah.
And I really like that because some of the technology is really futuristic. It's like that medical device, you know, you got to stick it up your ass, but like if it's going to diagnose you with your problems, that's great, right? Stick 3 things in you and get a full diagnosis. That's proper Star Trek technology. But at some point over the 500 years, this technology was invented and then it's kind of falling apart and going to ruin, and the people who operate it are like, it's like they've discovered an ancient technology. They sort of understand what it's for, but they're not smart enough to maintain it and really understand it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's sort of like, it's so believable in this dystopia as well, that they've got so much technology which could do amazing things, but they just don't know how to operate some of it as well. Like this stuff, it's probably just out there in the heaps of rubbish outside. Yeah. Like all of this amazing technology that they've made over the years, and it's just there.
Yeah, the heaps of rubbish are a key plot point, aren't they? Because it's kind of what triggers everything into motion in the film, but they're also an absolutely essential visual element of the film. It gives all of the character to the future world. So not just like the decrepit machines, but it's the dust bowls and the just piles and piles of rubbish absolutely everywhere that immediately place you into a world where public services have just completely broken down and nobody cares about anything. If we're just going to let mountains of rubbish pile up around and in our cities, clearly nobody cares about anything. Everyone's given up on everything.
And everything's kind of just put together really randomly. Like, they've got the buildings as well. The buildings really struck me because there's like one which looks like it's just been like gaffer taped around the other one and stuff like that. All of it's sort of, they don't have the capabilities to fix these problems, so they just leave them and they just do sort of like a half-assed job because that's all they're capable of doing.
And they don't even have the inclination and responsibility to fully demolish a building that is clearly falling down. It's just tape it back together and leave it, like a completely half-assed job, less than half-assed at every level of government and responsibility, all the way down to your doctors on the ground and your lawyer in court. Just any kind of level of responsibility is being shirked by everyone at all times.
They want to lead a life that is as easy as possible, where they have as little responsibility as they can handle. And like, even to the point where the lawyer, when he's at home, his chair is a toilet at the same time. And it's just like, everything is just so sort of, it's just there for like base needs. Everything's just like, they've just given into all of that kind of stuff.
But it's presented in quite a disgusting way, isn't it? And I did find it interesting because it was so similar to WALL-E, which is obviously very cute and charming and never really gets into just how disgusting living that kind of a life would be, whereas Idiocracy really embraces it and wants to present that level of disgust. Because I guess like the central thing at the heart of WALL-E is it's a kids movie and there's a lot of hope in it and things get back on track at the end of the movie. And I guess, I mean, things do get back on track, but the hopefulness of this film is quite low. Like the best possible outcome is the most average man in the world in 2006 becomes the leader and has to attempt to get things back on track.
So we talked about Joe's character quite a bit. What did you make of Rita? Because I didn't know quite what to make of her as a character in the film.
I think they haven't really made the most out of Maya Rudolph, who is...
She's great. Yeah. Maya Rudolph is so good.
But she doesn't really do anything in this film. She's just sort of like bouncing from scene to scene. And I think, I think the point was to have someone who was less intelligent than Joe join him, because she fits into, she's smarter than everybody else, but she's not that bright, I think. And she's able to kind of flourish because she's able to sort of take advantage of people, but not able to like restore humanity as Joe is, as is thrust onto Joe. But at the same time, she doesn't really do enough of that, does she? She just sort of like flits from scene to scene and then becomes a loose sort of love interest for Joe to make things better for him when he has to stay in the future.
And I just thought the fact that she's a prostitute was just a bit, I don't know, it just didn't quite make sense. But I mean, it didn't need to make sense, but it was just like, it felt like it was a bit superfluous to everything else. Like, it was good for a joke at the beginning, like, but it wasn't even that good as a joke then, because it was just this army guy who ends up dropping the N-word like as he's putting them to sleep, which again, bad terminology in this. It's just like it was just, I don't know, it just didn't make sense for me.
Yeah, it felt like something you would do in a comedy film from this era, more on the American Pie end of the spectrum, like what if the person going with him was a prostitute? Why not? Hey, it's bawdy, it's fun. It feels like that's kind of what it was, and it's definitely not making the most of Maya Rudolph, who can play very funny, but can also play, very compelling characters. And she's actually a really likable lead, and she's not allowed to be a particularly interesting lead in this film, which is a shame.
Yeah, and like, did you know that? Like, Fox really tried to bury this as well with the promotion.
Yeah, I don't really know why. I never really understand that. That stuff fascinates me, but there really is an element of like, do you not even want to make your budget back? Like, you have spent money on the film. Why are you going to bury it to the extent that it won't even make its budget back? I don't really understand that aspect of it.
I mean, they take the piss out of Fox News in it, but they must have got that past the producers and they must have sort of had all this stuff, and they've made an entire film. Like, they know it's done. They've had it. It's been done by 20th Century Fox. So it's like, why? I don't know. They just kind of like gave up on it, didn't they? And just were like, nah, let's get rid of this, sweep it under the rug, and no one has to hear about it.
I guess there's an element of like, even though you've spent your budget on it, if you, the producers, have decided that it's not going to be a hit, then you just want to get rid of it, so it won't be embarrassing. Maybe I don't know.
The fact is, did you watch this on Disney Plus?
No, I've got the DVD.
So I watched this on Disney Plus, and I found that quite interesting as well, given all of the stuff that Disney is censoring in their own films, that they've left a film like this uncensored.
What's Disney censoring in its own film?
Well, like in all of the things like A Song of the South will never come out on Disney Plus.
Oh, okay.
Like
I thought
that.
they put stuff like that out with like intros from, because like Whoopi Goldberg did some intros for some cartoons, I think. I thought they just added like
I think there's a few ones like that, but I'm not. Yeah, that sticks in my head as one in particular. But with this, there's no warning or anything like that. Or like even on Now TV, when you watch Aliens, there's like a thing in that which says like it's got problematic elements.
Just what do you think that is? Because I've had this conversation with another friend of mine who was a bit outraged by that, and I can only think of one line in that they might be referring to there. I think it's when, I can't remember who says it, but someone says to Vasquez, "Have you ever been mistaken for a man?" That's the only bit that I can think of.
I think it's Vasquez herself, because Vasquez isn't like Latino.
Yeah, she's doing brown
she's played by
face.
Jeanette Goldstein.
Yes.
So she's white. So that's what the problematic element in that film.
It's definitely. But so it doesn't say like the language is problematic. It just says, what's the warning say?
I can't remember what it says offhand, but it's got that element to it at the start.
That's definitely it. Thank you for clarifying that for me.
Yeah, good to know. So when you go back, because I was still shocked when I found that out.
Yeah, it's John Connor's foster mother, which she's unrecognisable, but yeah, one of the reasons she's unrecognisable is that she's wearing like darkening makeup.
Very, very tricky territory.
But that's a conversation for a future episode when we get onto Aliens.
Yes, which will happen eventually at some point.
Today I step into the shoes of a great man. A man by the name of Dwayne Elizondo Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho.
Under President Not Sure's leadership, a new era dawned.
You know, there was a time in this country when smart people were considered cool. Well, maybe not cool, but smart people did things like build ships and pyramids, and they even went to the moon.
So Joe is he's scooped up by this charismatic president and ordered to save the world. And Joe's not that bright himself, but he's bright enough to know you can't spray crops with brawn dough. You need to use water if you want plants to grow. And that is a massive success. And basically just off that one fairly simple and fundamental idea, he's able to save the world. Is this a hopeful ending at the end of Idiocracy?
It seems like it. Like they do sort of like, he becomes president eventually, and he's sort of like, he's trying to turn things around and make things better for people. But yeah, it's kind of a hopeful dystopian ending. I mean, it's the closest we've had, I think, like in terms of like a roundup. But there is a end credit scene, isn't there?
Yeah. There's, well, I mean, that whole subplot doesn't really, it literally doesn't make any sense, because why would Upgrade travel to the future instead? If you can find the cryosleep coffins, then why not just wake up Rita 500 years earlier? But I guess it is fairly hopeful, isn't it? Because the kind of the problem in society in Idiocracy that's led to a dystopia is this celebration of stupidity and embracing anti-intellectualism. And I guess Joe, being incredibly average, but in the context of the world, the smartest man in the world, he is being celebrated for his intelligence. So there's a sign that there's going to be a return to some kind of some kind of academic model of society, but the problem is that Joe is at the helm, and Joe is not too bright. He's incredibly average. So how are we going to get beyond? How are we going to advance society once we've got crops back and solved some of the absolute basic problems?
Yeah, and I think the thing that really sort of seems like they're going to be a bit more hopeful about it is the way that they're trying to change people's perspectives and like change the narrative around like intelligence for this society, because they're trying to change people's viewpoints and just get them to understand that, oh, intelligence isn't just something that's stupid. Like, it's not something you should laugh at. It's actually something which could help society. So it's the same with anything. If you're sort of like explaining why something is wrong and why this is better in a like articulate way, which makes sense to someone else, then that's how you bring about the change. And that's kind of what it's ending on, isn't it? That kind of message of we can change.
Yeah. So it's a happy ending. It is happy.
Yeah, let's say it's a happy. Yeah. It's the happy dystopian ending.
It's one of the happiest we've seen. Whereas Sleeper,
I mean, they have a big party at the White House as well. It's great.
The House of Representing. And it's a happier ending than Sleeper, which it's only through the dialogue, but Miles's wrap up of the competing political ideologies is quite is it nihilistic? I don't know if he'd go that far, but he's not too hopeful. He just wants to get his end away with Luna, which is, you know, a slightly bleak ending for Sleeper. So it's nicer to end on a more upbeat note with Idiocracy, isn't it?
So I think that was another interesting combination of comedy and sci-fi with these two films.
Yeah, it was very refreshing, wasn't it, James?
Yeah, very refreshing.
I've enjoyed this dip into more comedic dystopias. I'm sorry we didn't talk about Woody Allen more, but we're trying to keep things light this episode. So
I mean, we got into the deeper sort of like topics of conversation on Idiocracy as well, because there's quite a lot of stuff which we needed to sort of address with that one as well.
Yeah, sorry guys, it's actually been really heavy. It's just trying to keep things light with this episode.
Hey, it can't always be all sunshine and rainbows in sci-fi, can it?
Not this series. This is the Dystopia series. It's grim and grey and it's depressing. Get used to it.
It's bad. Everything is bad.
And things are going from bad to worse next time on the show, aren't they, James?
Oh, no.
It's going to be bad, but it's going to be very intense and short, because next time on the show, we're looking at one bad night in a dystopia, just a very short time frame where things are going incredibly wrong because of the miserable dystopian society. And what are the two films that we've got to look at for that, James?
So for next week's episode, we are going to be looking at one of my personal favourites, The Warriors from 1979.
Oh,
yes,
great.
Absolutely love it. I say that, we'll look at it again and there'll be lots of things wrong with it and I'll change my mind.
No, I don't think so. I think it's aged well, but I will eat my words next time if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, we will see if we both dig it. Can we dig it? We'll find out next week. But we'll be pairing that with The Purge from 2013, a horror, sci-fi-ish dystopia.
A grisly, mean, but fun horror film, The Purge. So hopefully we'll have some fun next week, because that's a couple of fun films, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's lots of naughty people in both of those films. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting one.
But in the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, you can, of course, do that, as you would always do, by sending us an email at journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com, or coming and finding us on Facebook and joining our discussion group and having a chat with us there.
And if you would like to support the podcast, you can sign up to Patreon, and there you can find bonus content for the small sum of £4 per month. You can join that tier and get access to bonus episodes on an abundance of different films and TV shows, and we regularly drop episodes over there. So yeah, why not come along and join?
And if you can't afford to do that, or you just don't want to, but you still want to support the show, that's absolutely fine. What you can do is leave us a 5-star review and put some text in the review, because that's really helpful. So if you want to do that, why not leave us a review and let us know what platform would you run on to get elected in Idiocracy.
Brilliant one. Well, that's it for this week's episode. We will see you next week for a bad night in a dystopia.